Hey folks, time for another Thinking Thursday. And today's thesis for this week's Thinking Thursday is thus: organizations, parties, movements, alliances, which are built upon being against something else, have a very limited shelf life and are really doomed to failure. I come about this thesis from looking at historical observation, both modern and ancient, and also a little bit of, personal experience. So I'd like to explain some of my thoughts with this. So let's imagine that we are in a geographic region and we don't have a whole lot of friends in that geographic region, but there's a big external force coming in to try to conquer us. There's an invading army. We can call our little neck of the woods Greece. We can call the invading army Persians. And in order to defeat the Persian incursion, we have to form an alliance. We have to form a league of city-states. And we get together and we say, the Persians are our mutual enemy. We'll go repel them. And we do it. We finally get the Persians to leave Greece. Well, what do we do after that? Do we maintain our alliance and then go out and conquer the other rebellious tribes? No. The alliance falls apart and you go back to fighting each other as city-states until another external force comes around that you are unable to ally yourselves against, such as Macedon. And that's it. That's the end of it. So military alliances will last as long as the common enemy exists. We see this with USA and the USSR. They were allied until basically Germany surrendered, and then they were no longer allied, right? Or until Japan surrendered, and then the alliance at that point was already falling apart, and then it became enemies. How about that? Isn't that funny? There's actually numerous cases throughout history of this happening. Alliances tend to be very short-lived because they tend to be built on being against another party, being against something else, and they will often fall apart before you're able to actually resolve the thing that you're against. A great example is the Numidians in Africa were allied with Carthage against Rome until Scipio Africanus managed to convince them to switch sides. So the leader of the Numidians, Massinissa, he switched sides to the Roman side, and because of his forces, his cavalry forces in particular, Scipio was able to defeat Hannibal in the Second Punic War and bring Carthage to heel. So that alliance against the mutual enemy of Rome did not even last through the war. They switched sides as soon as there was an advantage to them being able to switch sides, and that is another unfortunate reality. Now, if we look at things like, say, the Reformation, well, the Reformation quickly fell into many different little small Protestant sects with all their different little ideas, Anabaptists and all the different versions of Reform, Dutch Reform, and French Reform, Swiss Reform. And what stayed together was really the Catholic Church, what was left of the Catholic Church, because it had a thing that was it. It was the Catholic Church, whereas the Lutheran Church, very quickly we ended up with a bunch of different Protestant sects. You can look at the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists here in the United States. The Anti-Federalists were doomed to go away because their only core value was being against federalism. Now, going back to the military alliance thing, one of the reasons that the founding fathers of the United States wanted the 13 states, 13 colonies, to be unified in some sense, if not through a confederacy, through an actual strong union, is because they feared that people would wage war against each other. Well, why would the states wage war against each other? Well, that's because that's what states have always done. In fact, I think there's a quote by Thomas Sowell that says exactly that. That's what states have always done. They've always fought war with one another. So you make it one state, and they're not going to fight a war with each other. You can see this with modern movements too. The most recent example that comes to mind for me is Comicsgate. I knew last year that Comicsgate was going to flounder and fall apart. Mostly, and I've talked to some people who are in it about this, is that there was no transition from being against Marvel and DC and the SJW Marvel stuff, a transition from that into being for something. So it continued to be about complaining about Marvel and DC, and then once that kind of ran out of legs, then it just became a bunch of infighting. And so now I just pretty much call it Dramagate. It's mostly a dead hashtag on Twitter. There was elements in Gamergate that had the same thing, is that you were against some sort of bad reporting, not disclosing sexual relationships with game developers that you happen to be reviewing their game for, things like that. So objecting to that didn't transform into something that is specific and positive, and as a result, it kind of falls apart. This is the nature of things. So whenever you are constructing a party, and there's parties outside of this, outside of the United States, I just tend to focus on the United States because that's my experience. There's, anti-disestablishmentarianism, which is its own political movement that's against another against. Anyway, you can I'm sure inform me of some of those things from your particular country if you're from outside the United States. One of the things I really wanted to talk about with here, not just here in the United States, but the West in its entirety, is this idea of conservatism. So conservatism, by its definition, it's for conserving what exists. So you're not really for something. You're for what is, but you're really just against progressivism. So it's like there's the progressive mentality, which has been around for 100 years at this point in the United States, and then conservatism is against that. So what does conservatism need to transform into to be effective? Because one of the things we've seen really over the last however many decades, for the last 100 years really, conservatism in America has failed to conserve anything. And I would probably ask the same thing about the Tories in Britain, the Conservative Party. Have they conserved anything? Have they saved anything of value of the culture? And the problem with it is that if you are for the status quo, if you're for conserving what is, then you must be against what is not. But the nature of politics is that you are compromising. So the pressure is to compromise when any compromise, if you're from a conservative standpoint, any compromise with the progressive standpoint, whatever constitutes that, any compromise is a failure because you haven't conserved what you've set out to conserve. Not just that, but over time, the slow march will go from one side to the other. I'm trying to conserve it over here, and you're wanting to progress over here, so we'll compromise. And we'll compromise again, and until there's nothing left to compromise, until you're so close to the progressive or socialist ideal, whichever you happen to be against, social democrat, whatever you happen to be against, you're so close to it that there's really nothing left to barter with. There is no more compromise to be made. And so when I look at the U.S. political system, what are the conservatives doing? Like, they're not even they're compromising and giving up 90% of it. There's nothing left to save. Conservatism in America has been the biggest political failure in its entire history, and the reason is because it is against something rather than being for something. Well, what does it need to transform into? It needs to transform into revivalism. So revivalism is going backwards. So we call it regressivism, but revivalism sounds better. We need to have a revival of what worked previously. So we need to go back to something in the past. Lower taxes, lower economic regulations, or more community focus, less big cities, whatever the revival is. You need to be for something that's specific rather than against something. And as a result, when I look at the Republican Party here in the U.S., it's just a hodgepodge of positions. You got kind of free market libertarian guys who were more or less the classical liberals of yesteryear. They get lumped in with the old time conservatives who used to be in the Democrats, combined with just general what I would call conservative statists that want the state to keep culture a certain way, but none of them really get along. You have kind of a coalition. And that's the other problem too. Whenever you have a coalition or an alliance, it doesn't last very long. Those of you who are in parliamentary systems are probably familiar with this. Whenever no party is able to capture a minority, somebody forms a coalition government, and for a little while, there's a coalition government until it falls to bickering and infighting because they are fundamentally different in their perspectives on what the country needs. You just kind of side up with, they're kind of close. Maybe we'll be able to, form a government with them. And that's the problem. So anyway, that's my thesis. Those things which are against something else are very short-lived and are usually doomed to failure. You need to be for something. So Comicsgate needs to stop being about Comicsgate. It needs to be just about independent comics or something else. It needs to figure out something else. And that's kind of the way I view it. And you could say the same thing about American conservatism, probably a million other things that you can think of down in the comments down below. So let me know what you think about that thesis, and whether you know of any examples that support that or just kind of in contrast. I'm sure there's some exceptions out there, but that's my general observation historically. So thanks so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. You can find all my books on Amazon or find them at dvspress.com. Thanks.